Benjamin Franklin once said that in this world nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. Corporate tax, income tax, sales tax, property tax, wealth tax, inheritance tax. It seems like no matter what, we're always paying a diverse array of different taxes. Well, lately, there have been several countries that have been discussing another tax to add to that merry bunch, namely the digital tax. So what would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson at the Austrian Economics Center at Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria, and this week I'm going to go into a little bit of what Hayek would say about the digital tax. So first, when it comes to the digital tax, it's worth mentioning that there's been a lot of debates going on, both in the EU as well as in the OECD countries, about the digital tax. Essentially, an internet tax, a tax of internet goods. So the European Commission's proposal on this is designed to, in their words, ensure that online businesses contribute to public finances at the same level as traditional brick and mortar companies. Now, it's debatable whether digital companies are not already contributing their fair share, but in any case, I've included in the description some links both to the European Commission's proposals, they have two proposals as a matter of fact, as well as some links to studies that offer up counter-arguments to that. So on the one hand, if we take the European Commission side, a digital tax is desirable because companies are not being taxed in the same countries where they're creating value. So the digital tax is intended to bring this into balance. On the other side of the coin, though, one of the reasons why a digital tax would be undesirable is because it falls particularly heavily on GAFA, is the acronym, so namely Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, and it could increase protectionism. The reason it could increase protectionism is that if it's imposed in EU, or if it's imposed in European countries, it will fall heavily on 4 American companies. And so the European Union could expect retaliation from the American side, particularly under the present administration. Okay, so what's Hayek's view of taxation? Well, Hayek died in 1992, and so he never got a chance to elaborate his views specifically on digital taxation. Nevertheless, there are a few different locations in his works where he does talk about taxation and the philosophical underpinnings for his views on taxation. I would say that Hayek's views on taxation, or at least 2 things that he would say you need to bear in mind in evaluating a tax, are 1, clarity, and 2, that the tax be based on an objective standard. So let's take that second one first, the idea of it being based on an objective standard. Well, Hayek, in one of his works, The Constitution of Liberty, which was published in 1960, talks about the difference between progressive taxes and proportional taxes. And the difference essentially there, and he had a marked preference for the latter, for the proportional tax. The reason for that is that a proportional tax says, okay, well, for example, we're going to tax all of the people working in this country at 25% of their income. Simple as that. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're making a ton of money or not a lot of money at all, everyone has to pay 25% of their income. Now, Hayek really liked that because it meant that you treated everybody equally before the law. And if you're curious about this distinction between equality before the law on the one hand and equality of outcome on the other hand, then I've also included a link back to one of the earlier videos we did dealing with precisely this distinction in the context of George Floyd and racism in America. So Hayek would have preferred the proportional tax to the progressive one. The progressive tax says, by contrast, that people who are earning more should pay also more in taxes, either because everyone needs to give up and achieve a similar level of sacrifice, if you will, in their goods, or because you want to achieve a certain redistribution of income. Hayek's concern with that would have been that it leaves a lot of room open for abuse, that there is no potential ceiling to how much that the progressive taxes will be raised whenever the government needs to have more money. Okay, so when we come back to the digital tax, Hayek would want it to be, based on a principle or based on an objective standard. And perhaps the digital tax is principled in one sense. I mean, as the European Commission has mentioned, it's desirable because companies are not being taxed in the same countries where they're creating value, and so the digital tax is meant to create a balance between, to introduce a balance to this discrepancy. On the other side of the coin, though, Hayek might also ask, why is it that you need an extra tax on digital companies when they're already paying corporate taxes? Why discriminate specifically against digital companies and digital goods? Furthermore, and here we come to the first criterion I mentioned that Hayek would have when it comes to taxation, namely clarity. Furthermore, how does one define a digital company? What constitutes digital revenue, and how exactly is it supposed to be measured? And there are additional complications that issue from this as well. Law is something that's always territorial. It happens within a given sort of territory with respect to a given set of people. But the internet, by definition, is global. It's not located in any particular territory. It exists all over the world. So how exactly is it to be taxed properly without a global state, for example? Now, we needn't go that far, because Hayek actually does have something to say about taxation on a multilateral level versus on a unilateral level. What we're seeing right now is exactly the situation that Hayek would have had a problem with. Some European countries, for example, have introduced the digital tax while we're waiting for something to happen at a more multilateral level with the OECD countries or the European Union. And Hayek would have had a problem with this because it can lead to protectionism. Hayek probably would have said, if you must introduce a digital tax, then it should be multilateral. It should be with agreement amongst all countries so that it doesn't lead to a sort of tit-for-tat protectionist kind of war between countries. And indeed, this is actually precisely what's happening in the case of France. France has introduced a 3% digital tax, and the United States has threatened to retaliate. And so France now looks like it's backing down from that. Now, Hayek, though, would also have opposed governments trying to shift their tax burden onto companies outside of their country, especially if the government's main motive was just to find a way to expand their tax base. And in any case, companies might just end up shifting the burden to smaller firms, which would then end up having to shift the burden onto consumers. Once again, to use France as the example, Amazon declared that it would simply pass on the digital tax that the French government imposed on them onto French small and medium enterprises. So either French small and medium enterprises that sell on their website. So either these SMEs end up simply swallowing the additional costs, or they do what a lot of companies end up having to do. They pass them on to us, consumers. So consumers could be adversely affected by such a tax. And think of just how much we use when it comes to digital goods, how much time we spend on the internet. And finally, he would probably also have asked, what effect could the digital tax have on new incoming entrepreneurs to the digital market? Okay, so to recapitulate, Hayek would, one, when it comes to clarity, he would have said there's still a lot to be figured out. Two, Hayek would disapprove of a tax that leads to protectionism. And finally, three, the objective standard that's being used to justify the need for a digital tax may or may not be acceptable, but it really seems to turn on the question of why certain firms, however we define a digital firm for that matter, why it is that certain firms should pay more than the corporate tax that they're already paying. And in any case, a digital tax in its present form seems to leave room for some abuse. Okay, so now to broaden the discussion just a little bit, when it comes to any tax, Hayek would say that people should have an idea of what exactly they are paying and what exactly they're getting in return. To speak of taxation is therefore only really to speak of one side of the coin. So what's the other side of that coin then? Public expenditure. And Hayek would prefer that taxation be based on an objective standard, so in other words, his preference for the proportional tax, and then given the funds that have been collected, so whatever means the state has at its disposal, then it can be decided what sorts of public services can be offered. Instead, what we seem to have is the exact opposite of that. Governments have an increasing list of services that they want to provide. Now, some of them are provided more efficiently than other things. Some services that probably need to be provided are not being provided. And there are other services that are probably being provided that don't need to be provided at all. So governments have an increasing list of what it is they want to provide, and they need to find the money in order to provide it all. And that list seems to keep growing. I'd like to conclude with a quote from Hayek, who puts this a lot more elegantly than I ever could, and also establishes the connection between this economic issue of taxation, public expenditure, and finally politics, which we must always bear in the backs of our minds as well. This comes from a work of his called Law, Legislation, and Liberty, originally published in 3 volumes in 1973, 1976, and 1979, but it's still an excellent exposition of classical liberal principles for the 20th century, and indeed for the 21st century as well. So, Hayek says, the main concern of public finance, however, has from the beginning been to raise the largest sums with the least resistance. And what should have been the main consideration, namely that the method of raising the means should operate as a check on total expenditure, has been little considered. But a method of taxation that encourages the belief that the other fellow will pay for it, together with the admission of the principle that any majority has the right to tax minorities in accordance with rules which do not apply to the former, as in any overall progression of the tax burden, must produce a continuous growth of public expenditure beyond what the individual really desires. A rational and responsible decision on the volume of public expenditure by democratic vote presupposes that in each decision, the individual voters are aware that they will have to pay for the expenditure determined. Where those who consent to an item of expenditure do not know that they will have to pay for it, and the question that is considered is rather to whom the burden can be shifted, and where the majority in consequence feel that their decisions refer to expenditure to be paid for from other people's pockets, the result is that it is not expenditure which is adjusted to available means, but that means will be found to meet an expenditure which is determined without regard to costs. This process leads in the end to a general attitude which regards political pressure and the compulsion of others as the cheap way of paying for most services one desires. And that's what Hayek would say.